I never thought I'd be the daughter who would have to choose between having a relationship with my parents or having my self-respect. But when I finally saw the bank statements that revealed the truth about how they'd been handling money for my brother versus me for over a decade, I realized I'd been living a lie my entire adult life. And the education thing? That was just the beginning. My name is Sarah, I'm 32, and I'm the older sister in what I thought was a loving middle-class family. Growing up in suburban Ohio, my parents always emphasized the importance of education and hard work. My dad worked as a regional manager for a manufacturing company. Mom was a high school counselor. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, or so I believed. The first crack in my understanding came during my senior year of high school. I had always been the responsible one. Straight A's, student council, volunteer work at the local animal shelter. My younger brother Jake, 2 years behind me, was more of a free spirit. He struggled with grades, preferred video games to homework, and had this charming way of talking his way out of consequences. But he was funny and charismatic, and I loved him deeply. When it came time for college applications, I had my heart set on the state university about 2 hours away. It had a strong psychology program, and I'd been dreaming of becoming a therapist since I was 15. The tuition was reasonable for in-state students, and I'd saved money from my part-time job at the local library throughout high school. I remember sitting at our kitchen table with my parents, going through the financial aid paperwork. Mom had this concerned expression as she looked at the numbers. Dad kept running his hand through his hair, which he always did when he was stressed. They explained that while they wanted to help, they simply couldn't afford to cover my tuition. They'd looked into it, they said, but between the mortgage and regular expenses, it just wasn't feasible. I felt disappointed but not devastated. I understood that money was tight, and I'd been prepared for this possibility. We worked out a plan where I'd attend the local community college for 2 years, then transfer to complete my bachelor's degree. I'd take out student loans to cover what my part-time job and financial aid couldn't. It wasn't my dream scenario, but it felt reasonable and responsible. What I didn't know was that at the exact same time these conversations were happening, my parents had already put down a $5,000 deposit for Jake to attend Riverside Academy, a prestigious private boarding school about an hour away. I wouldn't discover this until years later, but the timing still makes my stomach turn. While they were explaining to me why they couldn't help with community college tuition, they were planning to spend $35,000 per year on my brother's high school education. The justification, I learned later, was that Jake needed more structure and individual attention. His grades were slipping, and they worried he wouldn't get into a good college without intervention. Riverside Academy specialized in students who were bright but struggled in traditional academic settings. The small class sizes and mandatory study halls would help him reach his potential. I started community college that fall, working 25 hours a week at a local retail store to help cover expenses. I lived at home, took the bus to campus, and packed lunches to save money. I told myself I was being practical and mature. I was proud of my independence and work ethic. When people asked about my choice, I'd explain that I was saving money and keeping my options open. Meanwhile, Jake was thriving at Riverside Academy. He came home for holidays with stories about his dormitory friends, the amazing hiking trails on campus, and teachers who really understood him. His grades improved dramatically, and he seemed more confident and focused. I was genuinely happy for him. I thought our parents had made a difficult financial sacrifice to give him this opportunity, and I respected their decision. During my second year at community college, I began the transfer process. I'd maintained a 3.8 GPA and had strong recommendations from my professors. I was excited to finally attend the state university and pursue my psychology degree. But when I brought up the transfer timeline with my parents, the financial conversation felt familiar and discouraging. They explained that they still couldn't contribute to my education costs. In fact, Dad had recently taken a small pay cut at work, and Mom was considering reducing her hours to help care for my aging grandmother. If anything, money was tighter than before. I'd need to take out additional loans to cover not just tuition, but also room and board, since the commute to the state university would be impractical. I felt that familiar pang of disappointment, but I also felt proud of my resilience. I'd proven I could handle the financial responsibility. I worked with a financial aid counselor to secure the necessary loans, picked up extra shifts at work to save money, and prepared to finally pursue my dream degree. The loan amounts felt overwhelming, but I reminded myself that education was an investment in my future. It was during this same period that Jake began his senior year at Riverside Academy. He was talking about college applications, and I noticed he seemed remarkably relaxed about the financial aspect. When I asked him about it, he mentioned that our parents had been setting aside money for his college education for years. He assumed they'd done the same for me. Something cold settled in my stomach during that conversation, but I pushed it away. Surely there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe they'd started saving after seeing how challenging it was for me to finance my education. Maybe they'd gotten a financial windfall I wasn't aware of. I didn't want to be the sister who resented her brother's opportunities. Jake ended up getting into 3 excellent universities. He chose a small liberal arts college in New England with a strong business program. The tuition was $45,000 per year, plus room and board. I remember him being excited but not stressed about the financial implications. Our parents seemed thrilled about his choice and proud of his acceptance. I was finishing my bachelor's degree that same year, working 30 hours a week while maintaining a full course load. My student loan debt was approaching $40,000, and I felt the weight of those monthly payments in my future. But I was also proud of what I'd accomplished. I'd made the dean's list multiple times, had secured a coveted internship at a local mental health clinic, and was planning to apply for graduate school in clinical psychology. The real revelation came during what should have been a celebratory family dinner. Jake had just finished his freshman year of college, and I had recently graduated with my bachelor's degree. We were all gathered at my parents' house, and the conversation turned to future plans. I mentioned that I was taking a gap year before graduate school to work full-time and save money, since graduate programs in psychology were competitive and expensive. Dad made a comment about how responsible I was being, how proud they were of my work ethic and independence. Mom chimed in about how character-building it was to earn my own way. They seemed to view my financial struggles as a positive personality trait, rather than a circumstance they'd helped create. Then Jake mentioned something about his study abroad program for the following year. He was planning to spend a semester in London, and he seemed confident it would be financially feasible. I asked him how he was managing the costs, and he looked confused by the question. He said our parents were covering it, just like they covered his regular tuition. The room got quiet. I looked at my parents, and I saw something I'd never seen before: guilt. Not the kind of guilt that comes from making a difficult decision, but the kind that comes from being caught in a deception. I asked the question that had been building in my mind for years. Why was Jake's education being fully funded while I'd taken on tens of thousands of dollars in debt? The answer, delivered with uncomfortable shifting and defensive explanations, was worse than I'd imagined. It turned out that not only had they been paying for Jake's private high school and college, but they'd also established a college fund for him when he was born. The same fund that I'd apparently never had, despite being the older child. They'd been contributing to it regularly throughout his childhood, which explained how they could afford his expensive education choices. The justification was that Jake needed more support and structure. I was naturally self-motivated and responsible, so I'd be fine figuring things out on my own. They'd actually seen my financial independence as proof that they'd made the right decision. They hadn't considered it a hardship I was enduring, but rather a strength I was demonstrating. I sat there processing this information, thinking about all the times I'd defended their choices to friends who questioned why my brother was at private school while I was at community college. I thought about all the extra shifts I'd worked, all the opportunities I'd passed up because of financial constraints, all the stress I'd experienced about money while pursuing my education. But it didn't stop there. As I began asking more questions, a fuller picture emerged. Jake's college fund wasn't just for tuition. It had covered his car, his spring break trips, his study abroad program, and even some of his living expenses during college. Meanwhile, I was driving a 12-year-old Honda Civic I'd bought with my own money and taking on credit card debt to afford basic necessities. The disparities extended beyond education. When Jake had wanted to take a gap year after high school to travel through Europe, they'd supported him financially. When I'd wanted to take a summer internship at a mental health facility in another state, they'd explained that they couldn't help with travel or housing costs, so I'd had to decline. I started to see a pattern that had been invisible to me before. Every time Jake faced a financial challenge or opportunity, our parents found a way to make it work. Every time I faced the same situation, I was encouraged to be independent and find my own solution. They'd framed this as character building for me and necessary support for him. The most painful realization was that they'd been actively concealing Jake's financial support from me. They'd never explicitly lied, but they'd allowed me to believe that they couldn't afford to help with my education while simultaneously funding his private school and college experience. They'd let me feel guilty for wanting their financial help while secretly providing extensive support to my brother. That dinner conversation changed everything. I left my parents' house that night feeling like I'd been living in a false reality. I wasn't angry at Jake. He'd been honest about his understanding of the situation. But I was devastated by the realization that my parents had been treating us fundamentally differently while presenting it as equal love expressed in different ways. I spent the next few weeks processing what I'd learned. I talked to my closest friends, and their reactions helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't normal family financial decision-making. They were shocked by the extent of the disparity and the deception involved. One friend pointed out that if my parents had been honest about their choice to prioritize Jake's education, I could have made different decisions about my own path. I decided I needed to have a more thorough conversation with my parents about what I'd discovered. I prepared carefully, writing down specific questions and examples. I wanted to understand their reasoning and give them a chance to explain their perspective. I also wanted to express how their choices had affected me and our relationship. The conversation was even more difficult than I'd anticipated. When I presented them with the full scope of what I'd realized, they became defensive and dismissive. They insisted that they'd done what was best for both of us, that different children required different approaches. They claimed that my strength and independence were evidence that their strategy had worked. What hurt most was their inability to acknowledge the impact of their choices on me. They couldn't seem to understand that their financial support of Jake wasn't just about money. It was about feeling valued and prioritized. They couldn't grasp that their deception had damaged my trust and sense of security within the family. Instead of taking responsibility, they turned the conversation back to my character. They said I was being ungrateful and resentful. They suggested that my reaction proved I was too focused on material things. They implied that my hurt feelings were immature and that I should be happy for my brother's success. I realized during that conversation that they weren't going to acknowledge what they'd done or take responsibility for how it had affected me. They'd constructed a narrative where their choices were justified and my pain was unreasonable. They seemed to believe their own justifications so completely that they couldn't see the situation from my perspective. But the real revelation came 6 months later, during what should have been a happy family occasion. Jake had gotten engaged to his college girlfriend, and they were planning a wedding for the following fall. During the initial wedding planning discussions, I learned that my parents had been saving for Jake's wedding since he'd turned 18. They'd accumulated nearly $30,000 in a special account designated for his future wedding expenses. When I asked if they'd done the same for me, the answer was no. They explained that they'd assumed I'd want a smaller, more intimate wedding anyway, given my practical nature. They suggested that I'd probably prefer to plan and pay for my own wedding, since I'd always been so independent. The casual way they delivered this information, as if it were obviously reasonable, was devastating. I realized that they'd been planning Jake's entire adult life while assuming I'd figure out my own. They'd been preparing to support him through college, travel, and major life milestones, while expecting me to be self-sufficient at every turn. I made a decision that night that changed the trajectory of my life. I decided I was done trying to earn their equal treatment through my achievements and good behavior. I was done accepting their narrative that differential treatment was somehow beneficial for me. I was done pretending that their financial favoritism didn't matter as long as they claimed to love us both. I started setting boundaries immediately. I told them I needed space to process what I'd learned and that I wouldn't be participating in family gatherings for a while. I explained that their choices had damaged my sense of security and trust, and that I needed time to decide how to move forward in our relationship. Their reaction was swift and telling. They accused me of being dramatic and manipulative. They said I was trying to ruin Jake's happiness and destroy the family over money. They told other family members that I was being unreasonable and ungrateful, painting me as the problem rather than examining their own behavior. But I'd expected this reaction and I was prepared for it. I'd been researching family dynamics and emotional manipulation, and I recognized their tactics. They were trying to make me feel guilty for having boundaries, to convince me that my hurt was unreasonable, and to pressure me into accepting their behavior through family drama. Instead, I focused on building my own life and career. I threw myself into my work at the mental health clinic, started graduate school part-time, and began building relationships with people who valued and respected me. I was determined to create the stability and support system that I'd been hoping to find within my family. The vindication came in an unexpected way. 2 years later, I received a call from a local television station. They were doing a feature story about young professionals making a difference in their communities, and someone had nominated me for my work with trauma survivors at the clinic. They wanted to interview me about my approach to helping people heal from family trauma and build healthy relationships. The interview went well, and the story aired during a popular evening news program. I talked about my work, my educational journey, and my passion for helping people establish healthy boundaries with difficult family members. I didn't mention my own family situation specifically, but I spoke about the importance of recognizing patterns of emotional manipulation and the courage required to prioritize your own well-being. The story got significant attention in our community. I received calls from colleagues, old friends, and even some family members who'd seen it. Several people mentioned how impressed they were with my accomplishments and my thoughtful approach to difficult family dynamics. A few people even said they'd been inspired to seek therapy for their own family issues. But the most significant response came from my parents. They called me the day after the story aired, and for the first time in our relationship, they sounded uncertain and reflective. They said they'd been proud to see me on television, but they'd also been disturbed by some of the things I'd said about emotional manipulation and family favoritism. They asked if I'd been talking about them. They wanted to know if I'd been discussing our family situation with my therapist and colleagues. They seemed genuinely concerned that other people might view their parenting choices negatively. I confirmed that yes, I had been working with a therapist to understand our family dynamics, and yes, I had learned to recognize patterns of favoritism and emotional manipulation. I explained that my work with trauma survivors had helped me understand my own experience and develop healthier boundaries. This conversation was different from our previous discussions. Instead of being defensive and dismissive, they seemed genuinely worried about how their behavior might be perceived by others. They asked specific questions about what I'd learned in therapy and whether I thought their treatment of Jake and me had been harmful. I explained that the issue wasn't just about money, but about feeling valued and prioritized. I told them that their deception had been as damaging as the financial disparity itself. I described how their inability to acknowledge my perspective had made me feel invisible and unimportant. For the first time, they seemed to actually hear what I was saying. They asked questions instead of making justifications. They acknowledged that they could see how their choices might have felt unfair to me, even if that hadn't been their intention. This conversation led to a series of discussions over the following months. With the help of my therapist, I was able to articulate my boundaries clearly. I explained that I wanted a relationship with them, but only if they could acknowledge the impact of their choices and demonstrate real change in how they treated me. I told them that I needed them to stop making excuses for their financial favoritism and start taking responsibility for how it had affected me. I needed them to stop pressuring me to accept their behavior and start working to earn back my trust. I needed them to stop treating my independence as a personality trait and start recognizing it as a survival mechanism. The process was gradual and sometimes frustrating. There were setbacks and moments when they reverted to their old patterns of defensiveness and manipulation, but there were also genuine moments of acknowledgement and growth. The turning point came during a conversation about Jake's upcoming wedding. Instead of assuming I'd figure out my own contribution to the festivities, they asked me directly how they could support my participation. They offered to help with travel expenses and made sure I was included in all the planning discussions. They also did something unprecedented. They acknowledged the financial disparity publicly. During a family gathering, they mentioned that they regretted not being more equitable in their educational support and that they were proud of what I'd accomplished despite the challenges they'd created. This public acknowledgement was important to me because it validated my experience in front of other family members who'd been told I was being unreasonable. It also demonstrated that they were willing to take responsibility for their choices rather than continuing to blame me for being hurt by them. But the most significant change was in how they started talking about my achievements. Instead of attributing my success to my natural independence, they began acknowledging the hard work and sacrifice that had been required. They started expressing regret about the opportunities I'd missed and the stress I'd endured because of their choices. I want to be clear that this process wasn't about getting revenge or proving a point. It was about establishing a relationship based on mutual respect and honesty. I didn't need them to punish Jake or take away his advantages. I needed them to acknowledge that their choices had affected me and to demonstrate that they valued me enough to change their behavior. The relationship I have with my parents now is different from what it was before, but it's also more honest and sustainable. They can't undo the financial disparity or the years of deception, but they've shown genuine remorse and made real changes in how they treat me. They've also been supportive of my continued education and career development in ways they never were before. I've learned that healthy family relationships require honesty, accountability, and mutual respect. They can't be based on one person constantly sacrificing their needs to maintain peace. They can't survive when some family members are systematically prioritized over others. I've also learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish or manipulative. It's necessary for maintaining your self-respect and creating relationships that are genuinely supportive. Sometimes the people who love us need to be confronted with the impact of their behavior before they can change it. My work with trauma survivors has taught me that many people struggle with family dynamics that make them feel invisible or unimportant. The patterns of favoritism, manipulation, and emotional neglect that I experienced are unfortunately common, but I've also learned that it's possible to heal from these experiences and build healthier relationships. If you're watching this and recognizing similar patterns in your own family, please know that your feelings are valid. You deserve to be valued and prioritized. You deserve honesty and respect from the people who claim to love you. You deserve relationships that support your growth rather than requiring you to sacrifice your needs. Setting boundaries with family members is never easy, but it's often necessary for your own well-being. It's not about being vindictive or cutting people off permanently. It's about creating space for genuine change and building relationships based on mutual respect. The process of healing from family trauma is ongoing, and it's not always linear. There are still moments when I feel hurt by the years of differential treatment. There are still times when I wonder what my life might have looked like if I'd had the same financial support as my brother. But I've also discovered strength and resilience that I didn't know I possessed. I've built a career that I'm passionate about, developed meaningful relationships with people who value me, and created the stability and security that I'd been seeking within my family. I've learned that your worth isn't determined by how your family treats you. It's not dependent on their recognition or approval. You have value regardless of whether the people who raised you can see it or acknowledge it. If you're struggling with similar family dynamics, I encourage you to seek support from a therapist, counselor, or trusted friend. You don't have to navigate these challenges alone, and you don't have to accept treatment that makes you feel invisible or unimportant. I also want to say that healing is possible, even when it feels impossible. Change is possible, even in relationships that have been damaged by years of dysfunction, but it requires honesty, accountability, and a genuine commitment to doing better. Your story matters, your feelings are valid, and you deserve relationships that celebrate your success rather than taking credit for your resilience. You deserve to be prioritized and valued, not just in words but in actions. Have you experienced similar patterns of favoritism or financial manipulation in your family? How did you navigate the process of setting boundaries and advocating for yourself? I'd love to hear your stories and support each other through these challenging but necessary conversations. Remember that speaking up about unfair treatment isn't being ungrateful or dramatic. It's being honest about your experience and advocating for the respect you deserve. Your voice matters, your perspective is valid, and your well-being is important. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes knowing that others have faced similar challenges and found ways to heal can be the encouragement someone needs to start their own journey toward healthier relationships. Thank you for listening and for being part of a community that values honesty, growth, and mutual support. Together, we can break cycles of dysfunction and build relationships based on genuine love and respect.